Hi, my name is Paulo Guimarães, and first of all, I would like to thank Mariano and Darren for this meeting. I also would like to apologize for not being able to join you this time due to bureaucratic issues. I hope you get together in the near future. I would love to discuss about ecological interactions, networks, and applied ecology with all of you. And also, I'm looking forward to the opportunity of see some old friends uh, again. Beijão, Ruli. Abraço, Diego. I will start first. I will start talking about a little bit what we have been doing in my lab and one possible way that I think that we can contribute to the problems that this collaboration could explore. So in my lab, our main research question is how ecological interactions affect and are affected by ecological and evolutionary processes. And to do so, we have been combining empirical data, network science, and mathematical modeling. Specifically, we have been working in three different topics. First, the structure of ecological networks, how ecological interactions, such as the interactions among plants and frugivores, lead to the emergence of complex networks. Second, how do evolution and coevolution progress when we move from pairwise interactions to complex network of interacting species? And finally, the erosion of networks, the destruction of networks, how networks are disassembled by human impact or other processes. To do so, we have been using interactions in the past. We are trying to reconstruct interactions among predators and prey in the Pleistocene, for instance, and try to recreate these networks in the computer and try to infer how human impact lead to the reorganization of these networks due to extinctions and essentially extinctions. I think that this meeting and this collaboration could allow us to move beyond these three topics by integrating them in a meaningful way, like generating really integrative work, generalize approaches that we have been doing in the lab, and try to provide some contributions to applied problems in ecology and evolution. In this talk, I will illustrate one of these approaches that I think that we can generalize to problems related to agricultural systems by first showing what we have been doing in a more theoretical perspective with these approaches, illustrate how we generalize to problems in evolution and then ecology and then in ecology. And I will focus in indirect effects. So indirect effects like the trophic cascades generated by top predators such as sea otters on their ecosystems are one of the most fundamental consequences of being part of a network. If you are part of a, if you are in a network, your fate is not only dependent of your properties, of the properties that you, of the elements that you interact directly, but also of the properties of non-interacting elements. Other elements that are part of that network may affect your fate. So an indirect effect is an effect that propagates through a chain through chains of direct interactions. In ecology, one fundamental example is trophic cascades. We have been working more in a coevolutionary perspective. And this is the work of a long-lasting collaboration among my group, my research group, and my good friends John Thompson, Pedro Jordano, and Jordi Bascompt. This work involved several students, former and current students in my lab, and postdocs. Both Pamela and Ana Paula are part of this research program. And to understand how we compute indirect effects, first I need to introduce and walk through a coevolutionary network model. And the aim of this model is, in a very simple way, try to describe trait evolution in a very simplified system. So how the average trait of a population change from one generation to the other due to ecological interactions. So Z represents a quantitative trait, is a model rooted in quantitative genetics, and this model has two components. The trait evolution will be mediated by the additive genetic variance that essentially describes the potential of the population to respond to selection, and the selection gradient that describes how the mean fitness of the population change when you change the mean trait value of this population. And this trait value can be any quantitative trait: the bill length, the flower shape, the body size. And this selection gradient looks particularly complicated, but actually is an average of essentially two different sources of selection. The selection imposed by the abiotic environment that we are assuming favors a particular trait value, theta, and the selection imposed by ecological interactions. And this model was developed for mutualistic interactions. We recently generalized it to antagonistic interactions, but we are assuming that the species are mutualistic here, and the species J generates a selection on species I that favors similar trait values. So one example would be the selection imposed by large body size in birds favoring large fruit size or seed size in plants. There is other forms of selection imposed by mutualisms, but here we are using this one, trait matching. And not all partners are identical in importance, so we are assuming that there is different evolutionary effects. So Qij is a coefficient that measures the effects of species J on selection over the traits of species I. We assume that this coefficient is not fixed, it evolves through time, generating a network trait feedback. I have no time to go to the details on this feedback now, but I'll be glad to discuss about the network trait feedback later if any one of you are interested on. What matters here is that these coefficients Q can be depicted as a matrix. So here, this matrix, we have in the rows species, in the columns species, and each element describes the selection imposed by a species in the column on a species in the row. So the hotter is the color, the stronger is the selection. Matrices and networks are interchangeable objects. They contain the same information. And we can imagine this matrix defining a network, a weighted network, in which the evolutionary effects are interaction strengths. So and then because of this relationship between networks and matrices, we can use very simple tools from linear algebra to estimate indirect effects. First, we need to recognize that the matrix Q just described the direct effects. And then, if we square this matrix, we now get a matrix that describes not direct interactions, but species that are linked by interactions, by pathways that involve two links, like I interact with J and J with L. Accordingly, if you get Q cubed, you end up with a matrix that describes pathways with length 3, 3 links apart. So species I affect species J that affect species L that affect species A, and so on. So the geometric series of matrices describe the, the effects of different pathways in terms of pathways differing in their length. This goes to the infinity, but if we assume that these indirect effects die off with pathway length, which means that pairs of species that interact, pairs of species that are distant to each other in the network are less likely to affect each other in an evolutionary sense, then despite the fact that there are infinite pathways, we can actually compute a matrix that describes the sum of all these effects. And this matrix is related to the matrix of interaction, but it's not the matrix interaction. We call them the matrix T, the coevolutionary matrix, and it's the inverse of the identity matrix minus Q. So in this matrix, we have two types of elements. The elements that involve pairwise interactions that occur, the pairs of species that directly interact with each other, and pairs of species that do not interact directly with each other. So the ratio between the effects in this matrix of the direct effects and the indirect effects allow us to estimate the contribution of indirect effects to coevolutionary dynamics. We parameterize this modeling approach with different networks from different mutualistic interactions, and this is our more interesting result. So here in the x-axis, we have an increase in the strength of selection imposed by mutualisms. In the y-axis, we have the increase of the contribution to trait of evolution of indirect effects in relationship to the direct effects. Each circle here represents the average of 1,000 simulations with a given parameterized with a given empirical network. Note that as you increase the strength of selection imposed by mutualisms, you increase the contribution of indirect effects. This result is robust to many assumptions of our model. So, if mutualisms are a relevant source of selection, indirect effects cannot be ignored. Or, if you want, indirect effects can be ignored when we study coevolution among mutualistic interactions if mutualistic interactions are irrelevant as a source of selection. Of course, this is valid to our model, but again, it is a result that is robust to many assumptions of our model. We recently used this approach to compute a matrix that sums all the infinite pathways among species, and then we can partition the direct and indirect effects in several different problems in evolution and in ecology. Like my former student Lucas Medeiros generalized this approach to two sites. So now the matrix T not only describes the effects of selection within sites, but also the effects of gene flow connecting the dynamics of two different sites. Again, the same matrix emerge, or a very similar matrix emerge, and we can partition out the effects of direct effects and indirect effects to coevolution. More recently, Ana Paula generalized this approach to multiple traits. So most of interactions involve more than one trait, like the interactions between This moth and this flower involve several traits, and these traits are not independent, but they are correlated across individuals. And this may have consequences to evolution and coevolution. And Paulo will talk more about that later, but by now what matters is that this a matrix of indirect effects that combine selection and the genetic correlation among traits, merging our models, allowing us to partition out the effects of direct interactions from the effects from the indirect effects of different interactions of species that do not interact with each other, sorry, and the correlation of traits. And even more recently, my former student Matthias Pires and I moved, generalized this approach to ecological dynamics. We are trying to understand the outcome of co-extinction cascades and trying to predict which species are more likely to die out after extinction be triggered by some external effect. We found that the probability of one species die out in a network is proportional to the amount of indirect effects connecting that species to the other species in the network. So, in this case, it's very interesting because because this model is very different in many of their their their, their characteristics. It's an ecological model, not an evolutionary model. Is not deterministic as our evolutionary models that are rooted in quantitative genetics. So it's a probabilistic model, and even so, the same approach allows us to get more insights into the ecological dynamics of the system. I think that if we move to the agricultural ecosystems designed by humans, then we can use the same approach to try to partition out the effects that are related to direct interactions from the effects that involve species that do not interact directly. We can use some of the tools that we developed for instance, the coevolution in landscapes, but it would be a very interesting challenge try to apply to an eco-evolutionary problem and try to understand how indirect effects may affect the dynamics in these novel ecosystems. Of course, in a modeling perspective, this will be a feasible task, although despite being a difficult task. But we all want to do what we all want to do is to get insights into what happens in the real world. And so the real challenge will be come up with some insights to empirical empirical systems, into things that we can measure in experiments. And I think that this group is exactly the group of people that we could try to work together to come up with some solutions to this kind of problem. In addition to try to contribute to agricultural ecosystems and to problems related to food security and the restoration of ecosystems, the study of agricultural ecosystems in terms of their indirect effects may allow us to get more to understand some of the features or the long-lasting questions in the ecology of species interactions. For me, one of the most fascinating aspects of ecological interactions is their resilience, their functionality amid the spatial heterogeneity, the complex phenotypes involved, and the species turnover across both space and time. This is perfectly illustrated by this picture. This is one of my favorite birds, Traupsaiaca, the sanhaço, in southeastern Brazil, feeding on the fruits of an invasive palm species. Despite the fact these species evolved in different places, their, despite the fact that their traits were shaped by ecological interactions with different species, when they get together, the interaction is functional and the animal actually is dispersing the seeds of the invasive palms. So how these interactions keep functional or create functionality despite of all this variation that is natural for for this kind of ecological interactions. This I think that agricultural ecosystems are very nice model system to address this problem because many novel interactions were created when we put together species that we domesticate, we our crop species, and then the weeds and the invasive species and the native species. I'm looking forward to explore more these questions with you. I would like to finish. Thank you, my lab, Laji, at USP, my collaborators, especially Marianne and Darren, for put together this symposium, this collaboration agreement, the funding agencies that support my work, and all of you for your attention. Again, forgive me for not being participating of this meeting, and I hope we get together soon. And I'm glad to answer any questions that you guys have by Skype or by email. Thank you ever so much.